Well, good afternoon. It's 5:30 p.m. Monday drive time, and welcome to the Kingdom and its Stories. My name is Julian Gibb, and along with Bob Moffat, I co-host this radio show where we have people come on, brothers and sisters who have lived a life searching and living for Jesus Christ. And today we're blessed to have our very own Marcus Doe. Marcus from Tucson. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Julian. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, Marcus, on this show, we're focusing on how people are reaching out to be Jesus's hands and feet. How are they making the Word of God come to life in people's life? And you and I were talking about another matter, and we were just sort of talking about your life, and I was just sort of blown away by the events that have taken place in your life and how God was using them in order to build you into the person that you are and the things that you now do. So, Marcus, tell us first of all, going backwards, tell us a little bit about your life history, going back from when you were a child.
Yeah, I'm glad I was able to kind of cross paths with you, being in Tucson. So it was really helpful to have a conversation with you, a couple of conversations. I grew up in a little country in West Africa called Liberia, and Liberia, little known to most Americans, it's just a country of about 5 million people. I grew up there, in the 80s. Liberia was founded by freed slaves from the United States in the 1840s, became independent in the 1840s. A lot of people, when the transatlantic slave trade ended, a lot of Liberians, a lot of Americans, Black freed slaves made their way to West Africa um, in order to find freedom, to find a place of liberty, and to establish a place of their own in West Africa. So they left America, a few ships landed, and they got in contact, and they formed this little country that was basically almost a carbon copy of what they had experienced in America. So there are cities in Liberia named after American presidents. The language is English. Um, the flag is almost the same as one star instead of 50. The government is president, Congress, kind of same things. So Liberians were never colonized like the rest of West Africa by either the French or the British. We were we were basically founded by freed slaves from the United States. But when those freed slaves got to Liberia, they met native people there, and they've always been kind of a contentious relationship, be it an existing one with the people there, between the natives and what we Liberians call Americo-Liberians, all the descendants of freed slaves. So yeah, a lot of connections. Whenever I have conversations with African Americans here, I tell them I eat the same foods that you eat. I ate back home, collard greens and chicken and all those things, and they think, wow, yeah, and we mix it with Native American foods.
So you're in Liberia, you're in, and then then what happened? I mean, now you're in Tucson. It's a big jump. What happened in between then?
What a big jump. So I grew up in Liberia. I was born in 79. I'm the last of 6 children of my parents. My father was the assistant director for administration for the Secret Service of the country. And my father had worked for 3 different presidents, the last of whom was a military dictator who had taken over in 1980. And his name was Samuel Doe. And we don't have any relation. My last name's Doe. We don't have any
Right.
relationship. But when Samuel Doe took over in this military coup, he killed a lot of ministers and a lot of government officials who were in the previous regime. But one of the few
Ah,
people he kept alive was my father and a few other people. And my father worked in the Secret Service, what's called the SSS in Liberia, all throughout the 80s. And Liberia was a very volatile place in the 1980s because it was a military government. President Doe, or Samuel Doe, was really nervous about opposition. So a lot of political opposition were exiled, and they were always constantly there were coup attempts against President Doe's life.
mm,
Several people wanted to take over the government because he was a poor leader, economically very poor, but the U.S. poured a ton of money into Liberia during the 80s, because there were American interests as far as communication
mm,
in Liberia. The Voice of America that serviced West Africa, American troops used Liberia as a staging place for the North African invasion during World War II. I think President
Mm.
Roosevelt visited Liberia. So a lot of American interest. Firestone Tires has a huge rubber plantation in Liberia. So a lot of American interest in Liberia during this
Okay.
time. But Doe mismanaged a lot of those things, and basically people began tiring of President Doe because he had rigged an election and made himself a civilian leader, and he was going on and on. So by the late '80s, people were so fed up with President Doe's leadership that there was an invasion of Liberia by a man named Charles Taylor
Okay.
from the north of Liberia. Charles Taylor was imprisoned in the United States and managed to escape and ended up back in North Africa and back in West Africa. And he started a
Wow.
war from the north, and
Okay.
quickly overtook the country within 6 months. Yes, Julian.
No, no, no. I said, wow.
Okay.
As in, like, this Taylor guy, but I don't you keep going. I've just, my wowing's interrupting. So so all this chaos in Liberia, and then what was the culmination, and what happened to you and your people?
So I'm 11 years old, and in the middle of 1990, Taylor's forces reached the capital city of Liberia, Monrovia. And my father, we heard on the radio that Taylor was his forces were ruthless towards people of Samuel Doe's tribe, anyone who worked for the government, anyone with the last name Doe, because they assumed that you were related to the president. So they were killing. Basically, it ended up being kind of an ethnic situation that his soldiers were exterminating people of certain tribes. And because of that, it became very difficult for us to escape the country. And Taylor had taken over the international airport, and there were no roads out of the country. So we couldn't escape as a family. So my father, knowing that his life was in danger and our lives were in danger, decided to send his kids, us, into hiding. And he sent me in early June of 1990 to go into hiding with my older brother, who had just gotten married and lived on the other side of the city. So I left my home at 11 years old and went across town to live with my older brother. A few weeks later, maybe a month later, Charles Taylor's forces reached our neighborhood and took over the area in which we lived.
Mm.
And those were the people who were wanting to kill people like me. And so we escaped. We're in hiding. We're behind. We're in their territory. And I saw bodies along the street when that day came for us to move, and it was tyranny that I didn't expect. And what I didn't expect, and what made me even more afraid for my life, was that a lot of the soldiers doing the killings were child soldiers. They were teenagers, some as young as I was at 11 at that point, and they were ruthless and very unmerciful. I saw that and I thought, man, I probably won't make it through this war. Eventually, I will get caught and I will get killed.
So how did you get out?
So a few months later, we lived behind Taylor's lines for a few months and eating one meal a day, not a gourmet meal by any chance, no clean water, anything like that. Because the situation in Liberia had gotten so dire, and those forces were holed up in the kind of the downtown area of the capital city. And Taylor's forces, the opposition, actually split into two different armies. So there was kind of a warlord situation. So it became a three-sided conflict in a small city that no one army had the power to overtake the other two. So the city just lay in siege, and they fought and fought and fought. The other West African countries noticed that, man, this situation in Liberia is really dire. So Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Guinea, and just the neighboring countries decided they were going to send troops to Liberia because it became a humanitarian crisis. People ask me, how come I never heard of this war? I never heard of this situation. It's because right when that was happening was when the first Gulf War was happening, when Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. So the world's attention was over there. And this is the same time this thing is happening in Liberia, and people are dying.
So how did you get to Ghana?
So the peacekeepers came and they took over some of the territory outside of the city, pushed Taylor's forces out of the area, and started taking people out of the country that had dire medical needs. severely malnourished, people who had been injured, yeah, X, Y, and Z. So my brother's wife was pregnant at the time, and she
Yeah.
needed medical attention. And her family, my brother, we were all able to get onto this supply ship in the port of Monrovia that brought in military supplies for the peacekeepers. And so we were able to get permission some way somehow to get on this ship. Not a luxury liner by any means. We got on the ship, slept on kind of the bed of the ship. I wasn't sure. I didn't know where the ship was going. I was just
Mm.
happy to be out of Liberia, to
Wow.
be out of the war after about a year.
Mm.
Um, so we got on the ship. The ship left Liberia in November of 1990. We're on the sea for about 2 days, and we landed in Ghana. And I was officially a refugee. Mind you, at this point, I don't know where my father is. I don't know where the rest of my siblings are. I don't know where any other family members are. So I'm living in Ghana, briefly in a refugee camp. But then my brother and his wife found work, and we moved. We moved out of the refugee camp. But I started going to school in Ghana. Had to learn two languages, partially two languages, to be able to exist and play with my friends outside of school. The turning point, I think, Julian, the turning point was my brother and his wife decided they were going to go back to Liberia because the peacekeepers had signed a peace agreement in Liberia, so things had quieted down. So they went back to Liberia to see if they could find any family members in the chaos of the aftermath of the conflict. And they went back. I stayed in Ghana, but when they came back, my brother brought me a letter that explained that my father had been captured, interrogated, and murdered.
Oh boy.
To take the story back 2 steps, my mother had also died the year before the war mysteriously. So I was an orphan. I didn't know it, but I had been an orphan for about a year, living in another country. So I lost um, I lost a lot, and I came to the conclusion that God really didn't not care, but I had trouble understanding God in the midst of all of that. We used to go to church. I went to Awana groups, and we sang the song "Red and Yellow, Black and White." They are precious in His sight, and I couldn't see how I was precious in God's sight at that point. So I made a vow to myself as a 12-year-old that one day I was going to find the man who killed my father, and I was going to exact some revenge as a 12-year-old.
Wow. Well, if you're listening, you're hearing the story of our brother Marcus and how he escaped tyranny from his country and became a refugee. You're listening to The Kingdom and its stories, and my name is Julian Gibb. But back to you, Marcus. So you Ghana had been humane enough to let you in. And then what happened? So then you had another move.
Yeah, I'm in Ghana for 3 years. About halfway through that process, my brother and his wife return, and they decide that we can't go back to Liberia because Liberia still isn't safe. So we applied and went through the process to become refugees, to immigrate to the United States. And that process is long, and I would like to spend some time here really quickly. The interviews, the vetting process to come to America is a very long and exhaustive process. To validate that you say you are who you are, for them to do their homework. So I went through, the interview process and was granted permission to come to the States. I think in November of 1992, and I
And
came.
then everything, and then from that point, everything was wonderful. You'd arrived in the promised land, and end of
I had
interview.
heard about America, and the things that I had heard about America were really positive things. But one of the things that I
Course,
heard
yeah.
that troubled me was the weather, right? Because I was a barefoot boy. I had never seen temperatures below 75 degrees. And I landed in Boston on March the 31st,
Wow.
right after a snowstorm. And it was brutal. I wanted to go right back. But the transition to America was way harder than I expected. My school transition was tough. I did not, because I spoke English just fine. So a lot of my teachers and counselors and school officials just assumed I had transferred from just another school in the country or the county. So I was handed a schedule, handed books, and basically left to go figure things out. And as a result, I struggled socially. I struggled
Mm.
a lot of ways. I mean, we were poor, so I didn't have clothes. I was on free lunch. I just didn't get it. I didn't do well in school at all. The teachers spoke way too fast, and part of it is kind of in my end. I was too afraid um,
Mm.
and too ashamed to talk to my teachers about the troubles that I was having, both in my mind and with academics. Whenever the room would get quiet in the classroom, we're taking a test or something, my brain would go back to the war. Mind you, I still don't know if the rest of my siblings are alive, and
Mm.
the war is still going on in Liberia. And so you try to make sense of that. And I went through high school just in a cloud of hatred, a cloud of sadness. I can't tell
Right.
you how many nights I cried myself to sleep, realizing that I would never see my parents again, or I may never see the rest of my siblings again.
So in your mind, so basically you've been thrown out of your country, you've become an orphan, you're by yourself in a wonderful yet strange country. Things don't make sense to you, and so you must have this psychological stress and tension constantly gnawing away at you. And what and as you were saying, like, thoughts of revenge. I mean, it's kind of like someone has done this to me and someone must pay. Now,
Absolutely.
I'm not going to go into that. If you want to learn more about that, everyone read his book, Catching Rice Birds. You can buy it on everywhere, no doubt. So, but how did you overcome with the fact that you had been stripped of everything? Your family, your character, your money. How did you overcome this hatred?
So I'm about 24 years old, and I had prayed a prayer back when I was 19, when I was in a really hard place, couldn't go to college, was just kind of languishing in the streets outside of DC. By 24, I was reading the Bible one morning, and I read the Lord's Prayer. And, I read that 150,000 times. I don't know how many times. But at the end of the Lord's Prayer, the verse right after that, Matthew 6, verse 14 and 15, Jesus talks about forgiveness. And he says, if you haven't forgiven those who have done something to you, this is my paraphrase, I will not forgive you. And at that
Mm,
point, my Christianity really hadn't reached to the point where I was in the process of thinking about forgiveness. I still had this hatred towards this man, that made me an orphan. Like I had nobody in my corner. So I had to face the fact that I needed to forgive the man who made me an orphan.
mm,
It took years. Um,
mm,
I started seeing a counselor, and we worked through what it would be like to sit face to face with the man who who made me where I was, who basically changed my life forever. Um, and so, at age 31, 20 years after I left Liberia,
yeah.
I decided to buy a ticket and go back to Liberia and
Huh.
find the man and have a conversation with him and tell him that I forgave him and I'm actually here for people like him in reconciliation. Because the Bible says, I mean, I think it's Ephesians 2 says, we've all been given a ministry of reconciliation in some way, shape, or form. And I felt like this was my sense of reconciliation. So I bought the ticket, went back. I will say this: when I went back after 20 years, the war had ended. My siblings were all alive. It was the greatest reunion that you can imagine. It was a long flight to get back to Liberia. And when I got back, my brothers and I stayed up all night, basically telling our stories to each other. We laughed, we cried, we celebrated, we mourned. I mean, I asked at one point in our conversation, I probably asked for 8 to 10 people in a row, and they told me that person was no longer alive. And I started walking the neighborhood. And because no one really talks about the war in Liberia, a lot of people in my old neighborhood assumed that I had died in a war because no one talks about it and no one had seen me in 20 years. So when I would go greet people that I used to hang out with and talk to, they were in tears, and it was just an amazing time in Liberia. And I I shared this before, but I was so happy being in Liberia. I gained 27 pounds in 5 weeks.
Yeah. Well, I'm good at that gaining weight thing as well. So, but so I mean, it's all good. You know, we're gonna have to have you back because like there's a lot of story here that I want to go through, and I don't want to do the disservice of squeezing it into 30 seconds. So, but I want to know is, you know, there's a big jump from saying, okay, I'm going to forgive someone. You know, the God tells me I need to forgive, you know, to love my enemies, you know. But it's a big jump from like reading it, believing it, and doing it, you know, actually making that intellectual assent come down to the heart where you can actually feel that forgiveness. So I don't know how long we've got left, but to tell me a little bit about that journey. How did you come from from accepting it in your brain to making it down to your heart?
I had to sit with God for years. Sit at that point, I was a single guy, so I would sit in my living room and actually talk to an empty chair, as if the man who I had hated for so long was sitting in my living room with me. And I would cry and I would yell and I would scream and I would and then I would cry and I would practice saying, I forgive you. And I just pictured him indifferent. What if he was indifferent? You know, what if he was angry? What if he didn't care? What if he chose to fight me? What if he was repentant? How will I engage all of that? And so it took me years to get through that. And I can't say how difficult it was to walk through that process. But yeah, I think that's
Did
where I
did
was for a few years.
did it require God? Did it require supernatural assistance, or was it? I mean, how you know? It sounds from you saying it sounds like you trained yourself into forgiving. You know, which is something like you constantly have to go back to God and say, all
Yeah.
right, I'm going to forgive this guy, but today I want to kill him. You know, so will you help me to get to where you want me to
Two
be?
minutes.
Yeah, I wasn't doing it out of my own strength because I could not do it out of my own strength. And still to this day, I think I still have like like a sentiment towards him that is complete is friendly now, but it was I had to work with God in that God Jesus came and forgave me for the things that I had done, and I am in no high position to look down on someone because of something they had done, even though it seems really terrible. I had to come to grips with it wouldn't bring my father back if I did anything to him. And I
Mm.
just could not live with myself because it was a cloud. I couldn't have relationships in any way, shape, or form until I had addressed this elephant in the room of my life
Mm.
that just held me. It was actually eating me more than than I understood. I think I'll stop there.
So this focus, this desire to revenge, to as you say, to murder was actually murdering you, killing you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I went through my 20s. I mean, just being, it affected me mentally, emotionally, and any relationships that I had were very, very shallow. I didn't want people to know who I really was and what was really eating me
30
inside when I
seconds.
was by myself.
So Marcus, can we have you back?
Absolutely. The second
Great.
part of the story is a God story. It's beautiful. Absolutely. I would be glad to come back. Yes.
Good, good, because I've tried to squeeze too much into a 30-second block, but we would love to have you back. So people listening, do tune in because the following week we're going to have Marcus back giving the other side of his story. This is the kingdom and its stories. May the Lord